Welcome to another episode of Delaware County Political News. I am your host, Larry DeMarco, with another episode of Meet the Expert. And we have Manly Parks with us today, a trial lawyer at Duane Morris, a Center City law firm and one of the 100 largest firms in the United States. Manly joined Duane Morris as an associate in January 1996 and was elevated to partner in January of 2003. His law practice at Duane Morris is focused on complex commercial litigation, including class actions, with a particular concentration on antitrust, franchise and distribution, and intellectual property issues, in particular trademarks, trade secrets, and copyrights. Manly is one of the highest rated attorneys by his peers. In 2015, he was awarded the Multilaw Service Award from the Multilaw Global Legal Network for his service as Chancellor and faculty member of the Multilaw Academy, an annual week-long training course for junior attorneys from Multilaw member firms from around the world. Regarding politics, Manly worked in his friend's Pennsylvania State Senate campaign against Ted Erickson in a special election in 2001 and was an election protection attorney for that race. Shortly thereafter, he successfully ran for Nether Providence Township Commission, where he served from 2004 to 2006. For the next 10 years, Manly coordinated election protection for Delaware County and state SESTAC congressional and senatorial campaigns, and the Obama and Clinton presidential campaigns, and served as legal counsel to Joe Sestac's Senate campaigns in 2010 and 2016. Manly became solicitor for Delaware County Democratic Party, a position he continues to serve in today. Manly, thank you for joining us here today.
Larry, it's my pleasure to be here.
Manly, you serve as the Democratic Party solicitor. What are the duties of a solicitor?
So the duties of the party solicitor include things like assisting with the updating or revision of the party bylaws, helping to guide the legal strategy in any legal matters in which the county party is a party in the litigation or otherwise involved. For example, serving as the rules interpreter under the Roberts Rules guidelines at party conventions and meetings, matters of those sorts. Really anything that involves party business where legal advice is necessary or valuable.
Manly, how does that differ from a government solicitor?
Like the Delaware County Solicitor, for example?
Exactly.
Okay, so the Delaware County Solicitor provides legal advice, or is essentially the lawyer for the Delaware County itself. I am the lawyer for a political party within Delaware County, namely the Democratic Party. So the county solicitor is doing an official job on behalf of the public for Delaware County, and I'm doing a job on behalf of a political party. But in both instances, we're providing legal advice. The nature of the legal advice is somewhat different because the legal advice I'm called on to give as the county party solicitor for the Democrats is political in nature, partisan in nature, because it's a political party scenario. A person who's a county solicitor is providing legal advice that should be nonpartisan. It should be on behalf of all of the people in the best interests of the county.
You talked about that you give legal advice, but do you also provide representation for court cases, should we say?
Absolutely. It depends on the case. There'll be some cases where I will be counsel of record for the party. There will be other cases where I will not be counsel of record. We'll have someone else from outside representing the party, and that I will be a behind-the-scenes consultant, or may even sit at the table in a trial or a proceeding representing the party, essentially as the party representative. like the client in a way. So I'll have multiple roles, and it just depends on the case and what's the most effective way to present the party's interest in that litigation. But yes, I've represented the party on a number of occasions in court.
Can you give the public some examples of some of the cases that you were involved in? Let's say the ID law situation.
So with respect to the voter ID litigation, that went up a couple of times to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and my role was to keep the party apprised of the developments in that case. The party was not an active litigant. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court struck down the voter ID law. The problem is that there were a lot of people in polling places, judges of election and election workers and partisans, who were under the impression that voter ID was a real law in Pennsylvania, and it wasn't. So our job was to try to make sure we had enough eyes and ears in the field. Those folks were aware of the lay of the land and where the law stood at the moment. And so they could advise judges of election and voters of what the real state of affairs was in Pennsylvania as that situation was unfolding. Ultimately, the court struck it down. That's now not an active issue, although even as recently as the presidential election, general election in November of 2016, judges of election and people working in polling places in Delaware County were requiring voters to show identification when the law did not require that. And just a kind of a note of public service here, even before the voter ID law that was eventually struck down was passed, there were some ID requirements under Pennsylvania law. If you're a voter for the first time at a polling place, so you either moved into that district or you were in the district you've always been in, but you finally turned 18 or you finally registered to vote, a first-time voter must show ID when they're voting for the first time at that polling place. Some folks get the idea, well, the voter ID law was struck down, no one should have to show ID ever. That's not the law in Pennsylvania. So it's a little more complicated. And then what ID counts is also complicated. Under the law as it currently stands, as it was before the voter ID law got passed, a wide range of identification is acceptable. Your voter ID card, various government issued IDs with pictures, some without, firearms permit, there are even a utility bill with your name on it, all would be acceptable forms of voter identification under the current law and what the law was before this voter ID law got passed and eventually suspended and struck down. Under the law that was passed, the list of IDs that were acceptable was much shorter, much more limited, and ultimately that was part of why the law got struck down, was it was very hard for people to get the kinds of IDs that were required under the law. And the court, rightly in my view, concluded that those requirements created an unfair hurdle for people to try to get the identification they would need under this new law. And frankly, the DMV that issues the IDs that were going to be acceptable had no plan to be able to even handle the volume of ID processing that would be necessary to get people the IDs that they were going to need to vote. And that became the heart of the opinion written, incidentally, by a Republican member of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
The DMV's inability to handle that.
Part of it was the DMV's inability to actually process the requests that were going to be forthcoming from people who wanted the IDs so they could vote. That was an interesting issue.
Do you anticipate any further ID laws coming down the pike?
The Pennsylvania legislature is controlled by a substantial Republican majority. Right now, as I see the lay of the land, it is part of the fundamental Republican orthodoxy to require identification. Now, we know that their stated purpose is to prevent voter fraud. We also know from every study that's ever been out there that voter fraud is microscopically small and effectively non-existent. What we also know is that the Republicans understand very clearly, and in fact admitted when they passed the last voter law, that the point of the voter ID is to suppress turnout from traditionally non-Republican constituencies. So it's a political tool.
You right there. It's not actually a law designed to prevent voter fraud. It's actually identity fraud, which is not a problem. Isn't that correct?
Well, I think that's some degree of semantics, because identity fraud is a form of voter fraud, right? If you walk into the polling place and say, I'm Joe Blow, and you're not Joe Blow, and you try to cast a ballot as Joe Blow, that's a form of voter fraud.
Which is not a problem, correct? Identity.
Yeah, and even voter fraud in the broader sense is not any meaningful problem. That was also part of the rationale that the court adopted in striking down the law. Is that there's really no problem to correct with this statute, and along the way of trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist, we're going to prevent access to the polling place for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of otherwise voting eligible citizens. So you're creating a very high hurdle to them exercising a fundamental right for no good reason, because there's a harm out there that's not really happening.
Which was my point.
So to your ultimate question from a moment ago, do I think there'll be more voter ID laws? I think so. So long as the Republican Party in Pennsylvania controls the legislature, and so long as voter identification laws are part of the fundamental orthodoxy of the Republican Party, I think there'll be initiatives to pass voter ID laws. And let's face it, there are political benefits to the Republicans from suppressing turnout from people who are not part of their constituency. Elections turn in small margins, and those types of conduct or laws could make the difference between winning and losing. And they're an increasingly unpopular party with a lot of people. And I think that, they could either change their view of the world and change their policies to reflect what the majority is interested in, or they could try to keep some members of the majority from coming to the polls and voting against them, and they seem to have chosen the latter. So that's where we are on that.
Okay.
That was my role in voter ID. I was also involved in the redistricting litigation in Pennsylvania. I represented a group of folks from Delaware County, various municipalities, including then Mayor of Swarthmore, Rick Lowe, and others, and there were a group of plaintiffs. We weren't the only plaintiffs in that case, but we were challenging the Republican-led redistricting effort. Interesting for Delaware County, because 2 of the 5 members of the redistricting commission were Delaware County Republicans, and they crafted a redistricting plan that was, in my view, patently unconstitutional.
And butchered Delaware
and
County
they
for that.
chopped up Delaware. We all know how small a borough Swarthmore is. They managed to find a way to cut it in half, or actually not to cut it in half. There are 3 voting precincts, and they put 1 in one district and 2 in the other district.
And they cut Yeadon.
They cut Yeadon. They cut a number of these tiny municipalities that are Democratic strongholds within the county, clearly to dilute the power of those voting blocks. And in other areas, they concentrated a bunch of Democratic areas with funny-shaped districts so that they could, for example, part of Swarthmore went into a district that included Chester, obviously to consolidate as many Democratic votes in that area as possible, as opposed to allowing those votes to be in other areas to make them more competitive districts. There's actually a language in the Pennsylvania state constitution that specifically says that natural voting municipalities and districts should not be divided unless necessary. And that was part of the basis for the challenge to the that redistricting plan, and we were very pleased that that case began and ended in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and we're very, very pleased to have prevailed on that and forced the legislature and the redistricting commission to go back to the drawing board and come up with a moderately fairer redistricting plan. Now, I wouldn't call it even-handed in the end.
I was going to ask you
it's a political enterprise, and it had a political outcome, but it was a whole lot more reasonable than the plan that split places like Darby Borough and Yeadon and Swarthmore in half.
But nonetheless, would you agree that the unfairness of this, the gerrymandering and this redistricting issue was a big part of what drove the Supreme Court race and election that elected 3 Supreme Court justices?
The Pennsylvania Supreme Court race in 2015 that put 3 Democrats on the court.
That's right.
Was absolutely driven in part, I think, by people's sense of the significance of having a court that was going to oversee the redistricting process in a fair way. Now, I will say, Justice Castile, who also, he wrote the voter ID decision I talked about a moment ago, he also wrote the redistricting decision. So he was the Chief Justice, he was a Republican, was I don't think particularly secretive about his political leanings, but he was, to his credit, fair within the spectrum that I would consider reasonable politically. And he wasn't willing to put aside the Constitution of the state for a political outcome like others were. And so he ruled in a block that included Democratic members of the Supreme Court in favor of the position being advocated by the Democrats in both of those cases, because he said that they crossed the line of constitutionality. Now, I think that those cases perhaps highlighted for voters the need to make sure that fair-minded people were on the Supreme Court, and let's not dismiss the qualifications of the Democratic candidates who ran for and won those races in 2015 at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court level. They were the better candidates on paper, and they won, I think, in part because of that. It wasn't all purely political. Sometimes when you run the better candidate, the more qualified, the more highly rated candidate, they win.
Manley, are there any other issues that might come up on the Superior Court docket that voters want to be aware of?
Well, issues may come up either in the Superior Court or possibly the Commonwealth Court, which is its parallel analog in the mid-level of the appellate structure in Pennsylvania, and they deal with various matters of state government and other issues that are unique jurisdiction issues from the Superior Court. But a couple of topics that are politically charged topics that I foresee potentially coming up in the courts. Reproductive rights is a possibility, although that's also something that could easily come up in federal courts because of the U.S. Constitution. And then I think it's very possible that we'll also see more activity in the courts. There already has been some about fracking, what the rules are going to be when, for example, local governments can dictate to fracking companies land use issues and that sort of thing. That's been a hot button issue, but I don't see that going away. I think that that's, it's obviously a very important thing economically for Pennsylvania, meaning that I think there'll be continued fracking activity. I think it's a little less economically robust right now because of some of the other alternative fuel sources and the fact that the proceeds from fracking are down from where they once were because of alternative energies right now, or alternative sources of energy. But I still see that being a big issue for Pennsylvania, politically charged issue that the courts will be dealing with pretty regularly for a while.
Please tune in for part 2 of my interview with Manley Parks, in which he discusses some of his legal battles in the county courthouse with the Republican Party.